Hi guys, so we are going to be talking about biopsychology today, which is basically a field that studies how our biology interacts with our psychology. Now, I like to say that this is kind of a false dichotomy, meaning that we separate biology and psychology, but they aren't really separate things. Your biology and your psychology are the same exact thing. When you feel angry, it's because of certain chemicals released in your brain and the rest of your body. If you feel happy, it's because of chemicals being released. And if you change those chemicals that are released, then that can also change your emotions. So one thing I want you to remember throughout this entire class is that your mind and your body are all the same, they're all interconnected, and they affect each other. So in this chapter, you can go through the learning objectives on your own if you want, so we'll just get started. So biopsychology, neuroscience, these are all, it's basically the same field, but psychology is more focused on the mind, whereas neuroscience may or may not affect the mind. But the biological perspective is important in both of these, looking at how the body works. But psychology often gets dropped from the biological perspective. So if you're a biologist, if you're a psychologist, we often drop the biological part. So for instance, it's very common for somebody to come into therapy and say they're depressed, and then you as the therapist will ask all about their history and their family and what's going on in their life, when it very well could be that they aren't eating well. Like if you don't have enough fat in your diet, it can cause depression. If you don't have enough protein in your diet, it can cause depression. If you have too many carbohydrates in your diet, it can cause depression. You could have a thyroid disorder. You could have cancer. You know, these biological things can cause a psychological outcome. So we also look at the link between our behavior and our genetics. Very often evolution comes into this, as in that we developed certain genes because it helped us to succeed. It helped us to, it changed our behavior, or our behavior changed, and therefore our genetics followed suit, which also created more likelihood to do certain behaviors and kind of cycled into this thing. Now, one of the criticisms of evolution is that it assumes that anything we're doing is making us better. We're always evolving. We're not devolving. Like this, there isn't a theory of devolution. But there's many things that us humans do that harm ourselves, like becoming addicted to alcohol, rape, murder, so on. So that's just something to keep in mind whenever we bring evolution into the picture, which is what we're doing now. All right, so I know you guys know a lot of this stuff, so I'm going to skip through this, or at least I assume that you do. When I was in high school, all my biology teacher ever talked about was evolution, so I always assumed that people got a big education in this. But basically, evolution is this theory, and remember, it is a theory. It's not proven law. It is a theory with some evidence behind it, which is argued about how good the evidence is. But always remember that it's just a theory. In school, it's usually taught as this is just a proven fact. It is not a proven fact. There is evidence behind it. There's also evidence against it. So it's something that scientists are still debating. So it is this gradual process of change over years, decades, centuries, millennia that helps a species to adapt to its environment. So that's the always getting better thing. We're always adapting and getting more able to function better within our environment. So basically, you know, you guys have all heard of Charles Darwin. In 1831, he sailed on this big research expedition on a ship called the Beagle, and he studied all of these native plants and animals, especially on the coast of South America. And he came up with this book that he wrote, The Origin of Species, and he noticed that many creatures were similar except for small changes, and he came up with the theory of evolution. And that has significantly changed how we view science as well as how we view life. This led to the eugenics movement, where we said that certain people have better genetics than others. So of course whites were at the top, and then depending on the scale, usually it's like white, Asians, blacks, Native Americans is about that's the evolutionary scale of genetic superiority. Now, the way they came about those decisions were not very research evidence-based. It was more just people are jerks. So yeah, that's not exactly proven. Anyhow, all right, moving on. So Darwin observed that animals adapt to their environment, and he believed that those adaptations would become written into the genetics, and the genetics would help the next generation to have those adaptations. And anybody who wasn't able to survive, they would die out. That's natural selection. And their bad genetics or non-adaptive genetics would not be passed down. And so then you only had a beneficial change as we adapt to the environment, generation to generation. All right, so we have applied evolution to psychology in many ways, one of which is unfortunately eugenics, where we say that certain people are better than others. And yes, people still believe that to this day, which is terrible, but anyhow, moving right along, just checking my notes, get back on track. I could do a whole lecture on eugenics and the stupidity of it. Anyhow, so one of the things that we look at in evolutionary psychology is how can we help people to adapt to their environment? How can we basically give natural selection a helping hand? Why do we do the things that we do, assuming that they must be adaptive because of evolution? Again, it's always a bad thing. It's what we would call bias, to do research with the assumption that things are a certain way. So there's an issue with evolutionary psychology in that anytime we go into research, we make the assumption, we have the bias that people are doing things because it must be adaptive. So for instance, there was a big scandal a couple decades back where researchers said that rape must be adaptive. It must be a good thing because otherwise we would not have developed the genetic tendency to rape others. And of course, there was a big backlash about that, as there should have been. For one thing, we don't know that that's genetic. And the second one is obviously it's not adaptive. It causes all sorts of problems for the individual doing the rape as well as obviously the victims. So that's just one of the issues to keep in mind whenever we do psychological research or just look at life in general with an evolutionary bias. That's not saying that it's not true. Again, it's a theory, so we can't legitimately scientifically say that it is true, and we also can't say that it's not true. But it has given us a lot of benefits, as you learned in the last chapter, or chapter 1. All right, anyhow, so the big thing with evolution is genetics. So we inherit this, I don't like quoting Nazis, but this always like struck me as an interesting way to look at genetics. So the Nazis believed that we inherited memories from previous generations. And it's kind of true, it's not really memories, but it's an interesting way of looking at it that we inherit the genes, which are sort of memories of how to do life more adaptively, as Darwin would put it. So I probably shouldn't be bringing up Nazis at all, but I don't approve of Nazis, but it was just an interesting way of looking at genetics. So genes encode information, information on how to function physically, how to function psychologically, how to behave within certain environments. And that information can be inherited from generation to generation. Now, everybody has different genetics. All of our genetics, or all organisms on the planet share some genetics. But every organism has at least a small percentage of genes that are different, which creates huge variety within living organisms. And then your experiences also change your genetics, which we're going to get into. I won't get into that too much now, but you can actually change your genetics, or at least the expression of your genetics. So anyhow, you receive half of your genes from one parent, half of your genes from another one. However, these genes are, it's like a lottery, it's totally random. And we say you receive half from each parent, but you can actually receive a bit more from one parent than the other. So sometimes you have kids who take after one parent like very strongly because they got a bit more genetics, particularly maybe in the psychology, personality area, or maybe the physical area. They look exactly like a certain parent. Some genes are stronger than others, so you have dominant and recessive genes. Our genetic inheritance we call the genotype. Do I have this on a slide? No, I don't. Okay, anyhow, you'll just have to take notes for yourself. So what we inherit, our DNA, is genotype, but how our genes are expressed is what we call the phenotype. So for instance, I've done a 23andMe where you spit into a tube and send it off, and they analyze your DNA and send it back to you. And I have the DNA for red hair. I don't have red hair, but I do have a genotype that has a gene for obviously brown hair. I have a gene for blonde hair, and I have a gene for red hair. So that means that I could pass those genes on to my children, and I could have a redhead, a blonde, or a brunette. I can't have somebody with black hair, though. I don't have the gene for that. So that's my genotype, but my phenotype is only brown hair. Actually, I was born with blonde hair. I had blonde hair for like 5 or 6 years, and then it turned brown. So, and it was straight, and now it's curly. So I have a genotype for curly and straight hair. But phenotypically, how I look, how it is expressed on the outside, I, at this point, only have curly brown hair. Okay, so my genes, your genes, have a lot of variation, but only certain genes get expressed. I also have the gene for ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, which is really nasty disease where basically your body stays functioning, your mind stays functioning, but your body, you lose complete control. Like you even start to lose the ability to swallow and breathe towards the end. So it's a terrible disease. So I have that in my genotype. Hopefully I will never have that expressed in my phenotype. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. Now the way you live your life can also determine what is expressed. So if you have the genotype for cancer and you smoke cigarettes, that may be phenotypically expressed because you smoke cigarettes. So you can actually cause certain genes to turn on or off depending on how you act. All right, so all of our DNA we call the genome. Our genome is comprised of 23 pairs of chromosomes, so you have 46 altogether, but 23 pairs, and then each chromosome has a coiled up strand of DNA. Let me change that slide, okay? So your chromosome, okay, your genome is the whole kit and caboodle. Then it is made up of 23 pairs of these chromosomes, okay? And then this is coiled up in 6 feet long of DNA strands. That is a lot of DNA packed into a little tiny space. Okay, and remember you've got 23 pairs of these within a cell. Okay, so that is really condensed information. Genes containing a single protein. Okay, they contain a single protein, and they're encoded in short segments of DNA, which is our instructions for how we develop. So some sections of the DNA are your hair color, some is your skin color, some is your personality, some are for cancer. Okay? And some sections of DNA are turned on, some are turned off. Okay? And then you can see these, the GCAT thing. These are the nucleotides. So DNA is made up of just 4 substances, okay, called nucleotides. And this is the coding for the instructions for what to do. So we often think of biology as so simple just because we've only taken basic biology classes and haven't really dug deep into this. But think about how complex your computer is. Just a single computer game on the computer, let alone everything else that a computer is able to do. You know, send people to the moon level stuff. And it only uses 2 codes, 0 and 1. Everything on a computer is coded in 0 and 1. And our DNA has 4. So imagine how much more complex that is than even what your computer is able to do. Okay, so it seems simple. It is not simple. All right, go on to the next slide. Okay. So when we look at genes to explain psychological characteristics such as how smart you are, what your personality is like, how you're able to read, how well you're able to read, things like that, whether you're depressed or not, we often look at the influence of our genetics. So is depression genetic? Yes, but it is complex. It's not just you have a gene for depression or you don't. Oftentimes you have multiple genes that cause one thing. Intelligence is not one gene. Intelligence is many, many genes, which is why when we get to the intelligence chapter, you'll see that psychologists and scientists argue about what even intelligence means, because multiple genes are responsible for it. So nothing is ever caused solely by genetics. Okay, so you may have the genes for something, but depending on your environment, it may or may not be expressed, like lung cancer and smoking. Okay, you may never have gotten lung cancer if you didn't smoke a cigarette, but your intelligence is the same way. So if you could have DNA to be a genius, you could be the next Albert Einstein, but if you are raised in a really bad environment, you're abused, you're in a bad school system, or maybe you're locked in a closet and you're never even allowed to go to school, obviously your genetic potential for intelligence is never going to be fully expressed. Okay, so there's always an interaction between genes and environment. Now, how much is genetic versus how much is of whatever is environmental can change drastically. So how much of gender is genetic? You have the genes for a boy or a girl. How much of being a boy or a girl is solely genetic, and how much is because of your environment teaching you what it means to be a boy or a girl? Happiness. Happiness is genetic. Okay? It's actually pretty strongly genetic. It's about 50% genetic, 50% environment. So if you have the genes for happiness, you could be in a bad environment and you could still be very happy because you are genetically a happy person. However, a bad enough environment, even if you have the genes for happiness, could still, the bad environment could drag you down. All right, so even if you look at identical twins, because they have different environments, they're going to have a different expression of their genetics. Okay, let's go on to the next one. All right, so I'm scrolling between two screens, so it's a little complicated. So epigenetics, this is the field of genetics environment interaction. So epi means above or on top of, and genetics, obviously your genes. So you have your genome, you have your DNA, and we used to believe that it was like impossible to change your DNA. The only things that really changes DNA, besides potentially Darwinian evolution, you've got millions of years of the environment impacting your genetics. So there's that, but then also you have mutations, such as like if you come across radiation, you're bit by a radioactive spider and you become Spider-Man. Okay, so your genetics are changed because of radiation mutating it. Now, one of the problems with mutations is that they're almost always bad. So the chances of you becoming Spider-Man, very slim. The chances of you dying of cancer, very high. So usually we don't change our DNA. However, epigenetics says that we can very easily control the expression of our DNA. And so we have found that there is an entire system on top of your DNA that controls the expression. So you have your genome and then you have your epigenome. So this is a picture of your epigenome interacting with your genome. So, well, kind of. Okay, let me explain. So you've got your chromosome, you unravel it, and you think, okay, you're just pulling the string of your DNA out, but it's actually coiled even all in here. So you've got these histones that your DNA strands are coiled around, sort of like a bobbin with sewing, if you've ever sewed. Does anybody sew anymore? So it is coiled around these discs called histones. And then, so it's coiled around these, and then so these all have tiny, tiny, tiny little histones in it. So it's coiled around the histones, coiled again, and coiled up into a chromosome. So, I mean, it is literally 6 feet long of DNA strands, so it's a pretty impressive system. All right, so what epigenomes does, there are proteins called methyl groups that will come and they will tag these histones. And they can tag them and they can cause them to uncoil or to coil tighter. If they coil tighter, they're really hard to read. And so that part of the genome is turned off. If it's uncoiled, it becomes easier to read, and now it's expressed. So when I was a kid and I had blonde hair, the blonde hair coil was loosened, and that was being read. And then it was tightened, and then my genome couldn't read it anymore, and my hair turned brown. So more extreme of an example, this could be the genome for cancer. You want that to stay tightly coiled. You don't want it to uncoil. But if you smoke a cigarette, now it could change your epigenome, and it doesn't tell this section of your genome to stay tightly coiled. Now it uncoils, your body can read it, and it starts to produce cancer cells. Okay? So that is epigenetics. All right, I'm going to put a video up on this so that it is easier for you to understand it. So if you're still confused at all. Okay, so your life experience can change how your genetics is expressed. So how you're parented. Were you abused by your parents? Or was it a high emotionally intense family life? Or did you have a calm, loving family? That's all going to change your epigenetics and cause certain things to be expressed, certain histones to uncoil or to coil, and that part of your genome to be activated. So loving, calm parental care helps your epigenome to activate positive sections of your genome and to deactivate or coil tighter the negative parts of our genome. Okay, so you're less likely to get depression if you had nice, loving, democratic parents. Okay, the way you eat, the toxins in the environment that you expose yourself to, all of these are going to influence your genome. Okay, so obviously you can see the epigenetics is where your psychology and your genetics are interacting. All right, so let's talk about the nervous system, okay, the neuron. So the neuron is the brain cell that helps your brain to communicate. Okay, so it's like the messenger path that sends messages between your brain and your body, between different parts of the brain. All right, so you have sensory neurons or afferent neurons, and these sense things, so all of your 5 senses. It's going to bring information to the brain. Motor neurons send information about movement. Interneurons, there's neurons in between these that all they are is just a bridge. Obviously they're important, but they're not doing anything besides transmitting the information. Sensory and motor neurons take in the information, so they're the beginning and end point. And then the interneurons are the bridge in between. Inter means between. Okay, so you've got like sensory neuron in your skin of your hand. Your skin receptors all have sensory neurons. Motor neurons in the muscle. They go tell an interneuron to send a message up to the brain, and then the sensory or the motor cortex of your brain receives that information. Okay. Now, this is actually pretty fascinating from a psychological perspective because there's things like if a pain neuron sends information to your brain that it's sensing pain, you can interfere with that neuron. Okay, so you can, interneurons can only send so much information. So the sensory neuron sends the information, but the interneuron can only take so much. So if you have pain information being sent up an interneuron, and you also tell a motor neuron to send information up by shaking your hand, you can block the pain the pain message from being sent to your brain. So if you ever hurt yourself and you shook your hand, that's what you're doing unconsciously. You didn't even know you were doing that, but you are blocking that sensory neuron's information with the motor neuron's information. Cold does the same too. So like if you have to have a shot or something and you put an ice cube next to where you're getting the injection, then it will block the sensory neuron's information, and the motor neuron, it gets priority for its message being sent. So it's just kind of interesting. All right, so how the neuron is built. So you have dendrite, soma, axon, synapse, which sends synaptic transmission, and the neurotransmitters. So let's look at a diagram of it. All right, so this is a neuron. You have the soma is the cell body with the nucleus inside. This is where all the DNA is stored. And then you have the dendrite and the axon. Do I have that on the next one? Yeah. Kind of have this all broken down. Okay. So let's just make this simple for you. Okay, so the information, there will be like another neuron here, and it will connect to the dendrites. The dendrites receive the information, sends it through the body, and out the other end of the axons. Okay? Dendrites, axons on this end. Okay, and the myelin sheath here, this is actually really important. This is insulation. It's like a fatty lipid insulation, and it works just like insulation on wires. So if you've ever seen a stripped wire that doesn't have the insulation on it, you know you don't want to touch that, right? Because electricity will jump from it to you and potentially kill you. So the myelin sheath does the same thing. It keeps the information going down the electric wiring of the brain. When we are young, the myelin sheath is not fully formed, which is why you wet the bed when you were a baby, possibly all the way up until your teenage years, because the myelin sheaths are still forming all the way up until your teenage years with some people. There's a medication they have nowadays for bedwetting for older kids, and what it does, it has nothing to do with your bladder, it helps the myelin sheath to form faster. Okay? So if you have a child that's wetting the bed, do not get angry at them. It is not their fault. Their myelin sheath is not formed. And even if you have an older child, even a teenager, even sometimes adults, their myelin sheath is not formed. So it has nothing to do with self-control. You don't want to buy, like, they have these zapping mats that will, when they sense moisture, they'll electrocute the kid. That actually exists. That's wrong, because it has nothing to do with self-control or discipline. Okay? It's all this myelin sheath here. All right, so at the end of the axon, you have these little buttons, okay, which are called terminal boutons. Okay? This says buttons, but it's actually boutons. Okay? But they are kind of like little buttons. And inside those, let's see, inside, this is the terminal bouton, okay, end of the axon. And inside of it are these little bubbles called vesicles. And those vesicles contain neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are little chemical messengers, and all their job is to move from the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of the other one and activate it. Okay? We call them chemical messengers. So in between each neuron, the neurons don't actually touch each other. They kind of float right next to each other. And this is, of course, microscopic level in your brain. There's billions, I think trillions of neurons in your brain. So it's this tiny, tiny gap, okay? But it's big enough that the neurons can't communicate to each other. They're not touching. So they actually will send these chemicals across the synaptic gap or synaptic cleft. And these chemicals, they're kind of like keys. And on the other side, there's locks. And if they fit into that lock, then they will activate the next neuron, and that's how the message is sent down through the brain. So we'll go back to this picture right here. This is something called the action potential, and I'm not going to get into the biology of this, but you've got sodium and potassium that they kind of change places, and that creates a current, and just like hydroelectricity with a dam, it generates electricity. And the action potential is the electricity that moves down the axon and triggers the neurotransmitters to be released into the synaptic cleft so that they can then activate the dendrites on the other side. Okay, if that is confusing, get on YouTube and watch some videos about neurons and action potentials, okay? Because I know I'm trying to keep this simple. It's very advanced biology, physiology. If you take physiology class at the college, you will be learning about this whole biological function of how it works. But basically, a neurotransmitter hits the dendrite on one side, triggers an electrical current to travel down the axon, and then gets to a terminal bouton and kicks the vesicle out into the synaptic cleft, where it then hits a receptor on the other side and then activates the next neuron all over again. And that's how electrical messages are sent in split seconds throughout the brain. It's pretty fascinating. We're not going to get into it in this chapter. Well, it's in the consciousness chapter, where these neurotransmitters act like, or drugs act like these neurotransmitters. So the reason why certain drugs give us a high and have an effect on us is because they mimic the structure of neurotransmitters. And so they can fit into these receptors and they can activate the next neuron. And that's how we get a high. And then if you are deficient in some of these neurotransmitters, like serotonin, you get depression. Serotonin, I mentioned that. The big names in serotonin that in neurotransmitters that you'll hear all the time are serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which is also adrenaline. So dopamine gives you a feeling of reward. So if somebody walks in your door and says, you just won $1 million, you're going to get a huge flood of dopamine. If you gamble and win, you're going to get dopamine. I'm looking to my side because I actually do currency trading. And I thought, oh, I wonder how I'm doing, see if I can get a little burst of dopamine, but no, I'm in the negative right now, so no dopamine for me, but it'll turn around. That's what gamblers say. Anyhow, so this motivates you, gives you a feeling of reward, makes you feel like things are right in the world. You can get this from cocaine, amphetamines, alcohol. Heroin is the big one. Cocaine and heroin are the ones that really release a lot of dopamine. A heroin addict, I heard say once that when he takes heroin, it feels like a mother's hug. And when he doesn't have his heroin and he's going into withdrawals, it feels like your dad slapping you across the back of the head. Okay, so dopamine makes you feel like everything is right with the world and really helps to motivate you. Serotonin makes you happy, but it's much more complicated than that. It does help with motives and emotions, helps with sleeping, dreaming. It regulates your mood, regulates pain, aggressiveness, your appetite, your sexual desires, even regulates your temperature. So like if you're taking, I can't think today, MDMA, ecstasy, when that raises serotonin levels. So, and it raises it a lot. And so a lot of people will spike a huge temperature, and that often ends with them in the hospital. So you go to any rave and there's going to be ambulances outside because they're just waiting for people with 106-degree fever who are frying their brain to have to be taken to the hospital and put into an ice bath to try to bring that temperature down. All right, Prozac, hallucinogens release serotonin. A lot of people say hallucinogens aren't addictive. Anything that releases serotonin has the potential to be addictive. But hallucinogens often affect different neurotransmitters that don't have as high of an addictive potential. Dopamine, highly, highly addictive, probably the most addictive neurotransmitter. Serotonin, not as much. And norepinephrine is pretty high too, but nothing beats dopamine. Okay. All right, moving right along. So I don't want to get too much into the biology of all of this. Glial cells are, well, like I said, I'm trying not to get too complicated for you, but the myelin sheath is made out of glial cells. They're kind of like support structures for the brain, the glue of the neurons. The spinal cord is made, well, I'm trying to think how to be simple about this. Helps to form new synapses, okay? So that's probably the most important thing. So we'll leave it at that. So myelin sheath, new synapses. That's what glial cells do. They are the structural support for the neurons, building them, keeping them together. Another thing that we should know is the term neural plasticity. Neural meaning your neurons, but plasticity means that your neurons can move and restructure themselves. When we are very young, we have very high neuroplasticity, and as we get older, we have less and less plasticity of our brain, which is, you know, the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's because their neuroplasticity has decreased. Whereas if you're a child learning an instrument or learning a new language, piece of cake. But the older you get, the harder it is to learn those things. Okay. Some ways that you see neuroplasticity, if you get into a car accident, for instance, and you damage a part of the brain can actually grow around that damaged part. So you may lose the ability to walk because neurons have been disconnected and you no longer have that information traveling, but you can reconnect it. We are even doing research where we're seeing that people who are quadriplegic may be able to reactivate those neurons. There's actually been some amazing studies where they built this it's kind of like this robot suit. Sounds very futuristic, but it literally is this robotic suit that you are put in, and it walks for you. And what it's doing is it's convincing your brain that you are doing the walking, and it's helping to stimulate neurons to regrow, which is just It's absolutely amazing. Okay. PTSD is physically is your neurons connecting in a bad way. So your neurons have connected certain stimuli to anxiety and fear. So a loud sound now means something to be afraid of. A crowd means something to be afraid of. Okay, so that's plasticity. Your brain was flexible enough to make that connection, which you don't want. Fortunately, the brain is plastic enough that it can disconnect that connection as well. And it's actually really easy to cure PTSD. The only problem is most people don't want to go through the treatment because it's obviously PTSD is scary, anxiety-ridden, and miserable to live through. Pornography also rewires your brain. It is a very, very bad thing for your brain, for your relationships, for everything in your life. I've never seen any study that shows any benefit of watching porn. Porn is addictive. Porn causes huge releases of dopamine, cocaine and amphetamine and heroin level releases of dopamine, so it's highly addictive. There's all sorts of rehabilitation facilities for porn addicts. It rewires your brain so that when you are having a relationship with another human, you don't get anywhere near the dopamine surge that you get with pornography. So people who watch porn progressively begin to prefer the pornography over sex with a real person. So that's all neuroplasticity. The brain is rewiring itself. Other things that cause the brain to rewire, on the negative side, watching TV, your brain starts to rewire. The more violence you watch, the more your brain is rewired to not react to the violence. So violence becomes more and more normal. So you especially don't want your children watching violent, gory TV shows or movies. And it also creates ADHD. So research has shown that if children 5 years and under watch TV, they have much higher levels of ADHD because the way the screen is flashing and scenes are moving so fast, it causes the brain to rewire so that the child is more prone to attention deficit disorder. On the bonus side, being out in nature also rewires your brain, and it rewires it in a way that is much more beneficial. You create more serotonin, more dopamine in life. You might have heard of a dopamine fast, where you're not going to watch TV, you're not going to eat junk food, you're going to not do anything that causes a dopamine release for like a week. And then afterwards, your brain is rewired to some degree and will now release dopamine when you hear a bird singing. Just a simple thing in life now causes you to feel good. All right, so good news is you can rewire your brain in good ways. Bad news is you can rewire it in bad ways. All right, so the nervous system. We have been talking about how the nervous system is built, but there are two sections. We've been talking mostly about the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord, but you have nerves throughout the rest of your body. Nerves and neurons are really the same thing, but neurons are in your brain and nerves are in your body or the peripheral nervous system. So basically the same, but in different sections, and so we title them differently so that we can differentiate between the two. Okay, so the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, they're really just where the structure is located. That's the most important part of remembering that. Then we have the autonomic nervous system, okay, and the somatic nervous system. So autonomic is communicating with the internal organs and the glands. So the part of your nervous structure that goes to your kidneys, your heart, and so on is what we would call the autonomic. And then you have the somatic nervous system, which communicates with your sensory organs and your voluntary muscles. Your involuntary muscles are in the autonomic nervous system. All right, so we've talked about this one, the sensory and the motor neurons. Okay, that's all part of the somatic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. One that we'll talk about more and you hear a lot of is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. These are all part of the autonomic nervous system, so this is internal organs and glands, and involuntary muscles, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so try to familiarize yourself with that breakdown. So the reason we talk about these a lot is because it's really interesting that they work against each other. They do opposites. So sympathetic nervous system arouses us. Now, when I say arousal, I do not mean sexual arousal. That is just one type of arousal. Getting angry is an arousal. Getting excited, feeling joy, feeling fear, those are all arousals. Arousal simply means an activation of the nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system has been activated. That is all an arousal is. We just don't use it properly. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system activates your body. Parasympathetic nervous system calms or deactivates the body. Okay. So if you are going to Magic Mountain, riding a roller coaster, you are activating your sympathetic nervous system. If you are going on a yoga retreat, you're activating your parasympathetic nervous system. So there is a place for both in life. If you didn't have both, you'd be dead. So they're both important. They both do different things. When you're angry, your sympathetic nervous system is causing that. When you are trying to take deep breaths and count to 10 or 1,000, as the case may be, you are trying to activate your parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so those are both important. We will be talking about those much more throughout this book, or this class. Okay, so that's just the same thing. So this is just kind of telling you what sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system controls. So sympathetic will dilate your pupils. It's what makes you cry, which is why, especially us girls, and it drives me crazy, you're pissed off at somebody and you start to cry. And it's like, I'm not sad, I just want to kill you. Well, that's because you have activated your sympathetic nervous system, which activates your tears. And for some reason, it does it more for girls than boys. I've heard that the crying part of the brain is closer to the angry part of the brain for women than it is for men. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I've heard. It gives you a dry mouth, stops you from salivating, makes you sweat more, accelerates your heart rate, dilates your bronchi so that you breathe more and increases your breathing, stops your stomach and your intestines from working. Because, I mean, think about it. What at our most basic survival, we need our sympathetic nervous system to outrun a lion that's chasing us, okay? You don't have time to digest your hamburger when a lion is chasing you. Okay, you can do that later. Secretes adrenaline, that's what gives you the energy burst, fight or flight response, decreases digestive functions of the intestines, inhibits bladder constriction. Let's just get rid of that urine and the feces. We don't need any of it if we're running from a lion. It's just going to weigh us down. We need to run as fast as we can. It also stops your reproductive system, so you're not going to ovulate. You're not going to make sperm when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, because again, you don't need to ovulate right now. You need to survive this lion attack. Now, the problem is then we become chronically stressed. Our sympathetic nervous system is always activated. Now our heart's working too hard. Our stomach isn't working hard enough. Our intestines aren't working hard enough. We might start wetting ourselves constantly, which happens a lot. Even adults who do not wet their bed, and when they're really stressed out, they may just one night wet their bed, and it's really weird. It's because you're so freaking stressed out that your sympathetic nervous system didn't allow your bladder to hold all night. Infertility issues. Why can't I get pregnant? Why can't I get my wife pregnant? It might be because you're so chronically stressed out, your sympathetic nervous system has turned that off. Okay? All right, now how does this all work? It happens through the endocrine system. So this is your hormonal system of your body, your thyroid gland, your ovaries, your testicles, your pancreas, all your adrenal glands, all the different glands of your body that produce hormones. These are your adrenal glands on your kidneys, what produces adrenaline, okay? So how does it respond in a crisis? So normal conditions, it's producing just what you need. Abnormal conditions, it produces everything that the sympathetic nervous system needs in order to activate the body so that you have a fight or flight response and you can outrun that lion. Okay? Oh, this would have made going through the list easier. Okay, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, I missed those two. Thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal gland, pancreas, adrenal glands, because you have two. Your pancreas, this is what burns out when you get diabetes, and your testes or ovaries. Okay, those are all your endocrine glands. So these are just the glands and the hormones, what the hormones do. So your pituitary regulates your ovaries and testes, breast milk production, your metabolism, reactions to stress. Let's go through some interesting. The thyroid one regulates your metabolism. So a lot of people who are obese, it might be that their thyroid's not working as well. Or if you're super, super skinny and you can't sleep, it could be your thyroid's working too well, things like that. Okay. Oops, I think I skipped something. Yes, I did. All right. Just a quick note here. Your pituitary gland is the master endocrine gland. It controls everything else in the body. So if it's out of whack, everything's out of whack. And really, the next one in line is probably, I think you could make an argument that the thyroid is the next master gland. If your thyroid is out of balance, nothing in your body is going to work right. It controls your appetite, it controls your fat use, it controls your energy production, it controls temperature, I mean everything. Everything. It regulates your reproductive system. Nothing is going to work right if your thyroid is not working. Okay, so kind of going on to a little bit different is the brain. Okay, so the pituitary, let's see if I can skip down to a picture of the brain. Do I have? Oh, I thought I had a picture specifically said. Okay, yeah, here we go. Okay, your pituitary gland. So this little dangly bit here, you can also see it there, right? So your pituitary gland, that's what I said, regulates glands all over the body. I like when I get things right. Okay, so we like to be able to look in the brain and see what's going on. Is your pituitary gland injured, and is that why nothing is functioning right for you? How big are the ventricles in the brain? The ventricles are these are like little hollow spaces. And we know that these are much bigger for people with schizophrenia. I'm not sure exactly why, but they're huge compared to other people. So looking into the brain, the structure of the brain can be very revealing information-wise, but also looking how the brain activates. We can do that now. So we can do these amazing scans that show which part of the brains are which part of the brain is activating and how much it's activating. So the blue, dark blue, not activated. Dark red, intensely activated. Okay, so we can look at brain waves with EEG. You'll learn about that with the sleeping section. EEG is electroencephalograph. You can put electric probes into the brain, and you can see how the neurons are communicating with each other, which can amazingly be done without damage or without a severe amount of damage, a noticeable amount of damage. You can also activate certain sections of the brain. So if you want to see what part of the brain causes anger, you put an electric probe in and you zap it and see if the person becomes angry. They have done this with people, but they did it with rats and things like that first to, well, you can get into the whole animal research debate later, but brain scans to me are the most interesting, seeing what areas of the brain activate, and it also allows you to not have to zap parts of the brain and stick probes in it. When you do that with humans, you literally have to cut the skull off, open the brain up, and do that. So anyhow, so we can do all these different scans, CT scans, PET scans, MRI, and then the fMRI or functional MRI is this one where you can see which parts of the brain are lighting up and being activated. But they're all very important parts of research. Okay. All right, so this is the structure of the brain. We won't spend too much time on this, but you have your cortex, and you have your limbic region, and then you have your brainstem. Often they call this like the alligator part of the brain, or this has all the life support systems if you're a Trekkie. Okay, this is all the life support here. There was a chicken once that, you can Google this, I'm not making it up. They chopped its head off to eat it for dinner, but they didn't chop off any of the brainstem. And because chickens are so stupid, now I have chickens, I like them, I'm sorry if I offend you, but because they are so stupid, the chicken didn't die, and it basically didn't change its behavior at all. Okay, it would still walk around scratching at the ground, it would still roost up on a branch. I mean, it still did everything a chicken did, because there wasn't much of this other part of the brain that controls emotions or higher level thought. Okay. Now this is a very, very basic outline of what the different sections of the brain does. Okay. So we say higher level thought, but the cortex or neocortex and the limbic system, they interact constantly. You don't have higher level thinking without emotions being part of it, unless you're, what's that guy, Spock, okay? So, and really the truth is, like, the TV show is fine and funny and everything, but the truth is that we don't think well unless we are also using our emotions. Now, they have to be used properly, but if you take emotions out of the equation, then what you get is like a homicidal sociopath who can kill people without feeling any emotional repercussions. So you want emotions, but obviously you want some training and you want the emotions to be moderate and under control. Okay, and that's why you do train people, like for the military or whatever, or surgeons get training so that they don't panic. But they do still need to use their emotions even while they're doing surgery. What if they nick an artery? How do they react to that? It's often just a gut emotional reaction that is incorporated with their intellectual cognitive skills of the cortex. Okay, so don't knock emotions. Yeah, you can read about that. I don't want to get too much into it, but just memorize what the different parts of the brain do. Okay, let's see. This is already a long lecture. So, one of the interesting things about the limbic system, that's this middle part, is that it controls emotions, like I said, but also memories, as well as much, much more things in the brain. Like the hypothalamus, for instance, where is it, the hippocampus? Shoot, now I can't remember. Don't worry, I'm not going to test you on this, but maybe it is the hippocampus. No, it's the hypothalamus. I don't remember. So even your teacher forgets things. But anyhow, one of these, I think is the hypothalamus, helps you to orient yourself in a map. So when you think of the street that you live on and how to get home and what streets you take, it's activating the limbic system, some part of the hippocampus or the hypothalamus in the limbic system, and it's giving you a visual picture, a visual map of the path that you're going to take. If that's damaged, you actually can't visualize things. So your ability to visualize is in your limbic system. You'd think that would be higher level intellectual thought, but it's actually part of the limbic emotional thinking. So that's why I said it's kind of blurry, the distinction between the two. But like, for instance, people who have that damage to the limbic system, if you ask them to think of a beach, they can kind of think of the colors, but they can't think of the sound. They can't think of seagulls squawking and waves hitting the beach, and they can't see the waves, and they can't feel the sand, but they can, like, they get a sense of it, but they can't actually give you a picture. They can't make up a story about it. So it's pretty fascinating. All right, the amygdala controls fear. The amygdala is a big one with like PTSD research and anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. And dang, I'm lecturing and I'm not paying attention to my currency exchange, and I think I might just close out of that one. Anyhow, so when you are afraid, it's because of the amygdala, especially like gut instinct sort of reactions. Like if a woman has been molested or raped, and then she goes to sleep with her husband and she's just like tenses up or completely panics and freaks out, it's the amygdala saying, hold on, this reminds me of this other dangerous situation and you need to be afraid. And so it will trigger a fight or flight response before you even have a chance to think about it. That's what's fascinating about the amygdala, is its ability to kind of emotionally hijack the body. So the amygdala reacts before the cortex is able to react and think. So like sensory information is traveling up the brainstem, the spinal cord into the brainstem. It hits the amygdala in the limbic system before it hits the cortex. So it actually gets to the emotions a split second before it gets to your cold hard logic. So it's able to react first, and it can completely hijack your endocrine system, your sympathetic nervous system. All right. Okay, so I've talked about the cerebral cortex, right? So your higher level thinking. And it's complex, like your personality is up here, and your ability to think about things you're seeing is back here because that's where our vision is located. So different sections of the brain, and you also have the two hemispheres, right? The brain is in two separate halves. So left hemisphere versus right hemisphere control different things, but it's all interacting. So, a 101 class tries to simplify things so much, and the truth is it's not simple. It's very complex, it's very interactive. We also have, I don't think I have a picture of, oh yeah, okay. So I'm skipping ahead in my lecture. But so you've got your two sides of the brain, the two hemispheres. And there's this part right here. This actually, it's cut in half, so you can't see it as well, but it's actually fibers that bridge back and forth between the two hemispheres of the brain so the brain can talk to each other. So some people have had surgeries where the corpus callosum is split or it's cut. Usually it's with epilepsy because a brain seizure will start on one side of the brain and go to the other. That's a grand mal seizure. And if you cut the corpus callosum, then the seizure will only get to half of the brain and it won't get to the other half. So with severe epilepsy, they'll cut this. So if it is cut, when they look with one eye, they know what this is, but they can't say what it is. Okay, because the visual and the verbal sides of the brain are in two different hemispheres. Okay, so the verbal side of the brain is the right hemisphere. Okay, so he's looking through this hole with his left eye. That would be the idea. And the left eye communicates, it crosses. So the left eye communicates with the right hemisphere. The right eye communicates with the left hemisphere. So when he is looking with that one eye and it sends the information to the verbal part, he can't verbally identify, even though he knows what it is. Now when he looks with the other eye, he can actually say what he's looking at. Okay? And that's because of the corpus callosum being cut. All right, let's see, what did I skip? Okay, talk about the frontal lobes. Frontal lobe is personality. It's has a role in speech. Mirror neurons, which is the neurons in our brain that make us experience what we're seeing other people do. So when you see somebody like smash really hard during a football game and you're, oh, that hurt, I can feel it. That's the mirror neurons doing that. You might see some stuff about phrenology as you study psychology. Phrenology is stupid. It's a cool idea, but it's stupid. So it looks at the bumps on the skull. So if you have a big bump here, then you're more combative, and if you have a bump here, you're more cautious. That it doesn't actually work. It would be cool if it did, but it doesn't. Right, so we have 4 lobes. I've talked about the frontal lobe up here, but we also have the temporal lobe, which is on the side. Okay, that's hearing. So we have 2 temporal lobes on either side. We've got 2 frontal lobes. We have 2 occipital lobes, and this is our vision. So sometimes if people are hit upside the back of the head, they can actually go blind. It's weird. You'd think it would have to be somewhere close to the eyes, but your vision, what you see, is processed at the back of the brain. And then you have your parietal lobe. Okay. I'm trying to think what else in here really needs to be gone over. Yeah, you can probably go over most of that yourself. Okay. All right, so 4 lobes. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. Now this is showing that in different areas of the brain, you have all those wrinkles, the sulci of the brain, they control different things. So this would be your somatosensory part of the cortex, so what you're feeling. So when you feel your toes, your leg, shoulder, wrist, hand, the feeling of swallowing and chewing. Now the brain, it's a weird picture. What this is showing is how much of the brain is dedicated to sensing these certain things. So your hands get a lot of neurons. A lot of the brain is dedicated to the feeling in your hands. A lot is dedicated to your face. Your lips especially have a lot of neurons dedicated to them. Okay, so hands, lips, things like that. Very sensitive. I talked about that. I think I mentioned parietal but didn't say what it does. So that's a lot of the parietal lobe is the somatosensory and motor cortex. Okay, we'll skip that. You can read about left and right processing on your own. We tend to be dominant on certain sides, so you're more artistic or more analytical, depending on the processing style of your brain. Okay, I talked a bit about the split brain, so you can read more about that because we're almost done. Okay, read more about cerebral dominance. Okay, so if you damage certain sides of your brain, obviously, since certain hemispheres have more control over certain things, then you know that damaging those can make you lose control over those areas. So you damage the left side of your brain, and things are crossed, so you could paralyze your right side. You could lose your speech and language. There's even some really interesting stories where people wake up speaking a different language. I don't know how that's possible, or they have a different accent. It is something that happens. It can change how you behave. So left brain damage can make you more slow and cautious. Damage the right brain and you can become more quick and impulsive. Damage the left brain and you could have memory deficits and language deficits. Damage the right brain and you have also memory deficits because, like I said, it's complex and interactive. And you could lose performance. You could lose spatial and perceptual rather than speech and language. Okay, so it's kind of fascinating what sections of the brain control which things, how they cross, and the nice thing is the neural plasticity. You damage the brain many times. Damage isn't too severe. The brain will rewire around the damaged spot. Like this is an MRI of a brain tumor. Okay, so this is, I think this is the right side, the right hemisphere of the brain. I'm not an MRI specialist, but this hemisphere would have severe damage. Even if they're able to remove this and the person survives, they're going to have right side brain damage, which means possibly paralyzed left side, spatial and perceptual deficits. They may be more quick and impulsive, more easy to anger, which, by the way, being really easy to anger is a possible sign of a brain tumor, okay, which is, but also excessively slow and cautious could be a sign of a brain damage on the other side, or a brain tumor on the other side of the brain, okay? So, but yeah, so the nice thing is you have your corpus callosum, that bridge, that helps the two hemispheres to interact. So even if you have damage, it may not be hugely noticeable because the brain is compensating and communicating with each other. The brain is plastic and rewiring. And so many times, like I have had an aunt, unfortunately she passed away, of a brain tumor. And it ran in her family. Everybody has died of a brain tumor by like, I think 40 or 50 years old, everybody. And the last time I saw her, I think she had 12 or 15 brain tumors removed. So she had a lot of her brain removed, and it wasn't that noticeable. She'd slowed down, and she was just kind of, like I described her as a softer person. She was just she seemed more innocent and soft and easygoing. It wasn't like, even with chunks of her brain taken out, she was still functioning, she was still raising her children, she was living a life, she was enjoyable to be around. And that's all because the brain is so amazing and can rewire itself. It has that plasticity, and yeah, it does everything it can to help you to survive. Okay, so I think we covered everything, at least a good survey of this chapter. If you have any questions, let me know, do your discussion board, and yeah, good luck.